Hello, everyone. Welcome to day one of the C3EB Summit. And so far, we've had a great morning, and we are starting our afternoon sessions with panels, with workshops and keynotes for the rest of the day. And we are kicking this off with our very first workshop with Dr. Alton James.
Hello.
Hi, Dr. Alton James. I'm going to, just again, before we get into this, quick housekeeping. Please join us on YouTube. You can comment. We are able to see the comments and we are able to respond to you. And we hope you enjoy this panel, and we also want to take this moment to thank all of our viewers who are tuning in live and also watching this later, as well as our sponsors and partners, without whom this session and this summit would not be possible. Essential IT, Defy the Status Quo Marketing, Zanzibar Enterprises, Nielsen, and of course, AJ Rao LLC. Thank you to all of you for the work that you've put in and for walking the walk with us. So before I hand it off to Dr. Alton James, I just want to tell you a little bit about him. Alton James, PhD, has dedicated his career to the education and liberation of disenfranchised and underrepresented peoples through the medium of storytelling, utilizing both words and music. Having earned his BA in English with minors in African American Studies and Music from the University of Michigan-Ann Arbor, go Blue, Alton followed with an MA in Educational Leadership and Policy at the U of M, Ann Arbor as well. Upon graduation, Alton taught English and music for both middle and high school students in Detroit. Alton served as an administrator at Wayne State University while earning his Ed.S and Ph.D in Educational Leadership and Policy. Through his personal ethos of moving people through storytelling, Alton continues to accomplish this through authorship as he actively publishes literature, scholarship, and by composing music for television and film. Alton is currently a compliance specialist and a Title IX investigator at Western Governors University. And today, Alton is here to share his insights with all of us on the case to erase race. So without further ado, it is with utmost pleasure that I welcome Dr. Alton James to this summit, to this workshop, to blow us away with his insights. Take it away, Dr. Alton.
Thank you, and welcome everyone. So my name is Alton James. I'm actually now a regional manager of regulatory affairs, so I'm on the compliance side of the house at Western Governors University and a Title IX investigator. And the one thing that I want to definitely give as a disclaimer beforehand, this is not in any way expressing the views of WGU or any of its affiliates. These are my ideas and the things I want to share with you all today. So let's jump right in. Now, one of the biggest things that I want to put forward is this is almost a caveat, but it's kind of a disclaimer, but it's kind of something to just think about as we move through this. Some of the ideas that I may express today may be at odds with what you've already heard during the summit or what may come up, because the ideas that I'm going to be talking about and expressing really kind of get to the heart of a lot of times how people identify. So one of the things I'm going to ask you all to do is just to have an open mind as we move through this. Think about things objectively. Let's not make any assumptions. And when the time is right, please feel free to ask away with as many questions that you may have. So let's dig into the meat and potatoes. So the biggest thing that my research is looking at advocating for is the idea that race, the social construct that was created out of indentured servitude and what we now know of as the American slavery system, it was all a fabrication to divide humans, to keep a power structure with a certain group, small group of individuals who owned land and who thought that they could own people, unfortunately. And the differences, the so-called differences that we see in various human groups, it's nothing but phenotype. It's not race, It doesn't have to do anything specifically with color. It's phenotype. So it's literally your genetics combined with the environment in which your ancestors happen to live under. So if you were further away from the equator, you didn't have as much sun exposure, so your body didn't need to produce as much melanin, so your skin is lighter. And therefore, if you're closer to the equator, you're darker. So there are different physical features that we see in different humans. It's just based on really the geographic history of one's ancestors. And it's important to note that because when we look at how people are treated in society, we get caught up in this idea of race when they're really just basic physical differences that we see in people based on that geographic history. So it's literally, if you're taking this from the dictionary, the set of observable characteristics of an individual resulting from the interaction of its genotype with the environment. That's going to be very important to keep in mind with the language that I'm going to use and how I actually express these ideas moving forward. As you can see, Africa is at the very center of this puzzle piece here. And the reason why is because we all know that the genetic origins of all humans derive from Africa. And so literally, when we're looking at people, we need to recognize more the similarities versus the differences that we see in people and what this is going to mean from a cultural standpoint, especially when we're looking at diversity and inclusion. So there are some really significant tenets that are going to govern the discussion that we're going to have today. And these tenets are actually based on a piece that I'm writing right now, an academic paper. And these tenets are probably going to strike a nerve in different ways. Again, I want you to think about keeping an open mind and how these things resonate with you individually and some of the trends you may see from a societal standpoint. And so let's look at the very first one. And that is humanity's collective lexicon. The language that we use is rooted in history and culture. So that's just a baseline that we all need to start with. And that past history manifests itself in the present when we use language today. So the words that we use really kind of has the history packed in of those words. Whether done explicitly or unwittingly, the use of a particular word allows that history and culture to persevere. Furthermore, this tenet posits that history and culture are a creation of past wars, genocide, human trafficking, bondage, conquest, imperialism, and various other forms of hegemony, the dominance of groups and nations based on some of these arbitrary definitions that we create to try to stratify people and define people. And those words are very simple, whether it's we're using the term white or black or minority. The language that we use essentially takes the humanity away from individuals. And as we'll explore more moving forward, these definitions actually are a barrier to human inclusiveness and acceptance of all different types of people. Let's keep going here. Tenet number 2. This is another one that really gets at the idea of how people identify and the communities in which they have an affinity for or they believe they have a connection to based on some of these similarities and differences. There is no benefit or societal currency in ubiquitously or homogeneously labeling large groups of people. Conversely, it is actually detrimental. There are far more differences, within groups than are recognized by society. Attempts to label large groups of people and subsequently ascribe culture to them needlessly stratifies humans, creates division, promotes segregation, and contributes to the harmful creation of prejudices and stereotypes. So let's unpack that a little bit because that is a little bit meaty. Essentially, when we label groups of people, we start to have expectations for what this person should be. For instance, how does one define the Black community? How does one define the white community? These are large social creations that mean very different things to very different people. And what happens is we can really fall into some dangerous traps. For instance, I believe it was about 2 months ago, the Smithsonian Museum of African American History in DC put out a statement, and they were ascribing two-parent households, kind of social balance and family harmony as aspects of white culture. And so when you start to do those type of things, you can seriously see how it actually creates ideas in people's heads about what someone should be or should not be just based on how they look. And that begins to be very dangerous. And we're going to actually unpack that as we keep going when we start to look at solutions for institutions and for individuals within their own lives. Tenet number 3. The differences seen in humans are simply a scientific historical map of ancestry based on geographical location and the resources, food, nutrition, climate, shelter, and technology available to the humans of those regions. There is even greater diversity in contemporary humanity, and there is a significantly decreased need, quote unquote need, to therefore label groups of humans. All of humanity derives from Africa. The phrase "there is only one race, the human race," is actually still problematic because there's no such thing as race. There's only one human species. Again, race has no basis in science, as it is a social construction. And this is just a funny thing because I love sci-fi and everything. But if humanity were to ever encounter an extraterrestrial species, and that's a lot of talk about that today, it would simply be a different species rather than an extraterrestrial or alien race. We wouldn't use the word race because literally that is a social fabrication that we've used to stratify humanity. We would just note it as another species. We keep saying, we want to send Mars rovers and we want to send spacecraft out into the depths of space, and we're looking for other species. We're looking for other life, but we're not describing those things in terms of race. Tenet number 4. Phenotype is the scientific and best way to denote physical similarities in groups of people. Yet, the only purpose for doing so should be for scientific health studies and to rectify injustice, whether from nature, biology, or nurture, environment, and human actions, from the historical effects of the socially constructed idea of race. This is a very important thing to note. So, we know that humans, based on their geographical history of their ancestors, have some different things health-wise. We notice some groups are more prone to sickle cell or diabetes or skin cancer. These are important things to track from a healthcare standpoint. But when we start to look at things from a social context, it's actually used as a detriment because we start to ascribe different characteristics to people, even though we don't know them as an individual. And again, we will continue to unpack this when we get to the solution section. Just for the sake of time, I want to move through these kind of quickly so we can get to the question and answer, as well as looking at solutions for these various pieces. Tenet number 5. In order to continue the efforts of eliminating race rhetoric, historical systemic oppression based on race should be referred to as phenotypic systemic oppression. The reason why it's important to not note things as race or racism is because there's no such thing as race. Again, it's a social construction. We need to call things as what they are. And it almost actually highlights the absolute stupidity, excuse my French, of humanity to actually have racist tendencies or oppressive tendencies, because we need to call out, you're literally oppressing people based on very, very minute differences in the genetic and phenotypic structure of various people on Earth. So it's literally judging a book by its cover, even though humanity continues to do so. This is very problematic. So labeling it as phenotypic systemic oppression, PSO, highlights how race is a system upheld by all of society, not just some, not just people who are so-called in power and those who are marginalized. It's upheld by all of society, by individuals collectively subscribing to the idea of race by not recognizing our common humanity. That differences are only found in early humans migrating away from the continent of Africa. So if you turn the clock back and you look at humans being concentrated just to the continent of Africa, there were a lot more similarities in humanity. But as humans have moved across the globe over the eons, those differences become a little bit more profound. But again, we're only talking about from a physical standpoint. Now, one of the things that has been a central part of my research is looking at some of Dr. Rachel Yehuda's work, and she actually studies the trauma from the survivors of the Holocaust. And she's actually found that that trauma is passed down epigenetically. So you can see the physical markers of trauma passed down from people when they have a similar experience from a cultural, or better yet, say, a geographical standpoint in the things that those people have endured. So as we look at how the idea of race has propagated and really shaped the way in which people not only interact with one another, but how they identify, these things actually have a cultural, social impact on these individuals and how they actually behave and do things in their everyday lives. This takes us to our last tenet, which what I just said ties directly into here. People who have been arbitrarily labeled in groups cannot fight the oppression they face if they define themselves by the oppressive labels ascribed to them. Therefore, subscribing to this type of reappropriation, as defined in the study of linguistics, only serves as a detriment to humanity. Now, this is one of the pieces that many would potentially disagree with me on. The study of linguistics talks about reappropriation, where you take a term that was meant to be derogatory or oppressive, and that group, that cultural group, then actually embraces that term and uses it positively. This is not something that I subscribe to. And again, I think when we look at words, it kind of goes back to the first tenet, really realizing the power of words. For instance, people within groups may use the N-word, and they may think that it's okay, but we know the power of that word because of someone who looks different, who has a different phenotypic background, so to speak, will, be shunned if they use that word. It's problematic. It's no different than if a man uses the B word to describe a woman. It's very, very problematic, but then you may see women who use that term amongst each other and use it in a positive framework. These are things that it's important to think about language. Again, the history, the past wars, genocide, the cultural dominance, the hegemony that are wrapped up into these words and how those words have impact today. It's very interesting. If you go back 100 years, if one used the term black to describe people of a predominant African phenotype, and I'll get into this language very shortly, it was very, very offensive. And the reason why it was very offensive is because we can trace back the origin of the use of these words and the original intent and the original meaning and how those pieces propagate now into the future. For instance, white, the term white literally means free from blemish, innocent, pure, while the term black means evil, wicked, sinful. And people actually start to, whether they understand it or not, they begin to subconsciously pull these pieces into their own psyche, into their own identity. So a lot of times when we have issues of folks not feeling included, people having low self-esteem, people suffering from the imposter syndrome, it's because in a way they've adopted this feeling of, oh, I'm different, I'm this or I'm that, what society tells me I am. And that's a very heavy weight to bear. It's something that is never going to be easily overcome when we continue to define ourselves by how those who have tried to oppress us are labeling us. So it's literally trying to free ourselves from these very meaty, heavy terms and characteristics that really have no societal cachet. It doesn't do anything to move humanity forward. All it does is to find a way to stratify us and to make us think of ourselves in ways that is actually detrimental to our own ability to interact and include one another. So now that we have these 6 tenets down, let's get into the actual solutions. Here are the meat and potatoes. One of the things that really resonates with me is looking at how we can attack things from 4 different pillars. And these 4 pillars are what we can do in terms of institutions, what we can do within our own families and how we teach one another, the interactions that we have with other people, and then the actual personal agency that we have to make changes. And the reason why the very top of this slide says remember is because humanity has been dismembered. And so we have to remember humanity, and we have to also, from a mind standpoint, remember the origins of the use of using these ubiquitous terms to describe and ascribe characteristics to people just based on how they look. And one of the things that we have to overcome, which is that little subscript under there, is tribalism. Humanity really suffers from tribalism, whether it's I'm a Democrat and I'm a Republican, and so that's a problem. Or I'm white, or I identify as white, or I identify as black, or I identify as someone is straight, or someone who is gay, or identify as a man, or identify as a woman. These are things that we have in our collective psyche and the things that we do as humans, and we just say, oh, that person's other. They're different. We otherize people based on these really frivolous and silly constructs that really mean nothing. At the end of the day, we need to be looking at how we can break the bonds of tribalism and see how can we find our collective humanity amongst all people, no matter what they look like, no matter what their genitalia is, all those different types of things. And so from an institutional standpoint, one of the things that's very important is looking at hiring practices. So one of the individuals from the panel discussion not that long ago was talking about capitalism, was looking at things within a U.S. context. And capitalism, obviously, the economic structure is going to really define a lot of the things that happen within society. And so we need to look at ways to have economic equity when it comes to different people and what they look like. It's actually one of the profound things when you look at the life and work of Dr. Martin Luther King. Obviously, he led a very successful movement for a decade, but he wasn't actually killed, and he wasn't really receiving the level of death threats until he started talking about economic equity. And so from an institutional standpoint, one of the biggest things are hiring practices. There's no reason why we should have names on resumes when they're submitted, when they actually get in front of hiring managers, because people are going to make biased decisions based on the names they see. People are going to make biased decisions based on someone's address. They may look up, oh, this person lives here, and that must mean something about them. And again, just like there's no reason to actually look at whether or not someone is a man or a woman. These are pieces that actually hurt the ability to have a diverse type of group when you're trying to look at all of these different factors. One of the things that's also very interesting is we need to look at the actual experiences of people that are not necessarily word for word what fits the job description, because people from different areas are going to actually have a diverse set of experiences which may improve one's department and the trajectory of that organization and institution. But there are times in which actually using addresses or certain community type of factors could be a benefit. For instance, if you're looking for certain pieces to bolster a community, it's important to actually hire the people that live and work in those communities. So if you're talking about teachers, if you're talking about firefighters, if you're talking about police officers, these are people that are going to have a vested interest in seeing the actual communities do well. And so what that actually attacks is the segregation that we see amongst various communities. So you can be in one community and it looks very homogenous, and you can go to one just a couple miles away and that looks very homogenous. But one of the things that we see, particularly in my own experience in the southeastern Michigan, Detroit metropolitan area, you can have people that work in Detroit in the inner city, but are coming from the suburbs, excuse me. And so you're really seeing a very, very big economic disparity for the people that live there. The people live there, and they're not the people that are serving in those institutions. They're not the people serving their neighbors and the people around them. And so we lose a sense of community when we have those type of situations. But as we look to the institutional way in which we can infuse division, it's because we're having people make racial and ethnic identifications about themselves when those pieces are not always appropriate. And I will talk about that in the interaction section when we look at the data standpoint of that. Now, moving to family. Family is the first school in the home. It's, whether it's a guardian, a grandparents, parents, the people close around young people. It's how we talk to them about these ideas and how we actually shape their identity moving forward. So it's very important when you look at, for instance, children's television. I have a young son, and one of the most beautiful things about the programming on there is you watch Sesame Street or something like that. They never define someone as white or black. These are divisions that children's programming knows is detrimental. They know it's problematic. They definitely talk about different cultures, but just because someone looks a certain way doesn't mean they're going to fall into a specific racial category that society has created. And so it's very important to say to our young people, society may call you this, but you're not this. You're just another human being. And when we look at people as individuals, we actually perform the best type of diversity and inclusion we can possibly do, because just because society may think that I'm something or call me something doesn't mean that I necessarily fall into those attributes that people have ascribed. And so it's very dangerous when we think about and we say, well, this is white society, or this is white culture, or this is black culture, because not everyone is going to fall into those categories. We need to see people as individuals, and that's actually going to be the most freeing thing for people to have inclusion and feel included, amongst themselves and amongst their peers. But this would be remiss without this other interaction piece. And one of the most detrimental things, I think all of us have probably heard of, the books, why do all the black kids sit together in the lunchroom, and all of those different types of things when we see people break apart in various institutions or in parts of society. They congregate to one area. People, they may have the same religious faith, but when they actually go to their places of worship, it looks very homogenous, or looks very different from someone just a few miles down the road. And so one of the things we have to be very, very intentional about, whether it's from an institutional standpoint or whether it's in our own personal lives, is to find a way to interact with people with whom we may never interact with before, whether that's because our neighborhoods are segregated or not very diverse, or because our workplaces aren't. But it's very important that we start to interact with different types of people, because those are the best ways to actually break down a lot of the stereotypes and prejudices that people have. It's very hard to harbor hatred for someone if you're around them all the time and you live with them and you do extracurricular activities and you go to the gym with them and you work with them and you live in the same neighborhoods. These are very, very difficult things to do. And one of the things that has come out of the research that I've done is looking at how those things actually started to fade somewhat in the 80s, or just prior to the 80s, leading into the early 80s. But as we started to do more privatization, as the country has started to move more jobs overseas, as suburbia has sprawled, as unions have been dissolved, those were things that actually had people working together from very different walks of life. And when we look at, I don't want to get into the depths of unions and the bonuses and the things that are detrimental about unions, but one of the things we can say is we look at how different people have been together. They've worked together for common interests. And if you turn the clock back and you look back to when race really became a staple of society, it was really after Bacon's Rebellion. And Bacon's Rebellion, to go back with a history lesson, it was when indentured servants of both African ancestry and European ancestry fought together because they said, we're not going to take this oppression. We're not going to live and die in this state of destitution and servitude. It's not right. And so literally at that point, it was, we're going to identify the servant class based on what they look like. And that just made the the ability to actually keep people in servitude much easier if you could readily identify just by looking at them who they were and what they were serving. And when you look at how that construct has moved throughout society, it's made people believe they are white and believe they are black. And one of the things that I think hurts us in today's modern context is the way in which we ascribe characteristics to certain groups of people. You may hear in certain arenas where people who identify as black or so-called black people will say, you know, all white people are racist. And this is something that actually is echoed by Jane Elliott, who's a phenomenal ally and someone who looks to end discrimination based on the way someone looks. But that's problematic because then we lose the potential allies that we could have in various different communities, because perhaps Africans may see themselves differently as African Americans or so-called African Americans. There's a break there where we could actually have more allyship and connection amongst all peoples to say, you know what, there's an injustice over here and this is not okay. And that's actually one of the famous ideas from Dr. Martin Luther King. He said, an injustice anywhere is an injustice everywhere. And until we see that it doesn't matter whether or not someone has a certain skin color or comes from a certain background or from a certain area, we just see an injustice as an injustice. That's going to be the way in which we move forward. And obviously 2020 has been a crazy year. It's been a lot of tumultuous times. And, you know, for instance, if we go back and we look at the senseless murder of George Floyd, this is one of the things I want to get across to people. If Officer Chauvin didn't see George Floyd as a black man, he would have never killed him. And that just goes back to the way in which we push forward these attributes on people based on these arbitrary definitions. Obviously, I mentioned black. The original intent and meaning means dirty or less than human or wicked. And we use that language in all types of things. We talk about the dark arts. We talk about little white lies. And these ideas propagate and they move forward. If Officer Chauvin just saw him as a human being, not a black man, not a man, not someone who was poor, not someone who was doing something that he shouldn't have been doing. If he just saw him as a human being, we wouldn't be in this situation. And that's one of the things that we have to push forward within our interactions with other people and think about how we can be intentional about reaching out to people that don't look like us. And it's not a reaching out where, hey, I think you're different than me, or you're this or you're that, like tell me who you are. It's literally just seeing other people as humans, identifying them as an individual, seeing what makes them tick as an individual person, because people are very different. There are no major umbrellas. There's no homogeneity of blackness or whiteness or whatever the case may be. These are constructions that we've created that just continue to divide us. And until we start to look at how we can interact with people just because they're another person, we won't be able to get past that. And that leads to the fourth and final pillar, which is just agency. And it's do what you can with what you have. So if you are a police officer, a police chief, don't allow your the officers in your keep or your station to say, we're looking for a suspect and it's a black person. Well, that doesn't mean anything. Is it someone who has always lived in Africa? They have African phenotypes, or is it someone who's always lived in the United States and they have a little bit more of a blend of phenotypic features? Is the person albino? Are they not albino? Are they African albino or American albino? These are very large distinctions across different people. We should be talking about the size of the person's eyes, the structure of their nose or their cheekbones, and the actual color of their skin. and their hairstyle, things of that nature. Because if we just say these large, overarching bubble terms, they really mean nothing, but the consequences mean everything. And so we have to think about how the words that we use, the way in which we think about people, and try to um, include people that we're not actually ascribing terms to them or ascribing characteristics or having prejudicial thoughts or even assumptions about who these people are based on some of these really arbitrary terms that have always been there to divide and oppress people. And so that's one of the biggest things I want to leave people with, is thinking about how we can actually break down these terms, break down the actual way in which we try to label people. Because at the end of the day, we're always going to come into problems. We have to think about people as individuals. And if people within our organizations, people within our lives want to come together based on certain characteristics that they may have, we need to celebrate those similarities and differences, and we need to actually let those people live out those things. But we're not going to think about them differently. We're not going to try to put them in a certain context within our workplaces or within our social lives. And so I really want everyone to remember that they have the power and agency to make the changes that they want to see within their own context. Obviously, everyone's not a hiring manager. Everyone is not someone high up in the media who is actually indoctrinating these ideas into people. But in our everyday lives, in the way in which we interact with our coworkers and our friends and the people in our community, we have the ability to move the needle forward. And as we do that, we need to keep in mind that anytime people have these identities, they may say, I'm white, or I'm black, or I'm this, or I'm that. To understand that these ideas can be really difficult for people to think about, because it is getting at the heart of their identity. But I think as we move forward, it's really going to be freeing to those individuals and to humanity when we just see them as individuals, not as something that society tells them that they should be. And so with that, I want to give you all the opportunity to ask questions and to move the needle forward as we talk about some of these constructs. And I'm going to move this screen over here.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Dr. James, that was amazing. That was so insightful. My phone on my end was blowing up with how interesting your entire presentation and workshop was. While we're waiting for our viewers' questions, I actually have a question for you. You raised some very interesting points about, in your Remember, when we talk about institution, interaction, family, and agency.
Right.
One of the things that I struggle with, which both you and I, as parents,
Right.
How do we not just model, but how do we go about teaching our children to adopt adopt an identity not based on race, in a society that's still fundamentally rooted in racial constructs?
Right. That's a great question. I think, first of all, it's letting them know that society may call you this, society may view you as this, but you're not this. So it's important to definitely understand that society may have this idea about you. But if I can, I want to share one of my favorite stories. When I started teaching, my mentor teacher was trying to tell me a story about these two students. They're first graders. And one had a European phenotypic background and one had an African phenotypic background. And the one that had a European phenotype was trying to describe this other kid to the teacher, like, where did blah, blah, blah go? And they were like, it's the kid with the blah, blah, blah backpack, and they wear blah, blah, blah. They didn't have the language to say, this person is black. And I think that is one of the most beautiful things that that was ever shared with me, because these things are learned. These are really ingrained constructs that are learned. And if we teach that to our kids, then they're going to grow up with it. They're going to innately have that. And I think it's our responsibility to equip them with the knowledge that you're not this. Society may view you as this, but when you have that idea uh, really wrapped in your brain, it changes the way you think. It changes the way you operate. And really quickly, some of the research I'm doing now, which I did in my dissertation, and it's funny because it's data that I didn't pay attention to, but now it's come up again in another research study I'm doing now. And one of the most amazing things, when you look at people who identify as black and who identify as white and all these different subsects that society creates, their achievement levels are actually lower than the people who do not identify as any racial category. And I think that's amazing because I think a lot of some of the things that hold us back are the oppressive constructs that we harbor in our own identity. And so that's going to be some interesting research that I'm going to continue fleshing out and putting out. But I think when we harbor those really large societal ideas, we actually limit the ability for ourselves to be free from an intellectual, academic, and even just holistic, happy place as individuals.
Absolutely. We do have a couple of questions in the chat box. The first
Wonderful.
one is from Lauren James. And I just realized this is a panel with two Dr. AJs. Uh,
Yeah, it is.
um, that's great. But so Lauren's question is, if we don't call ourselves Black, what do you suggest we call ourselves?
That's amazing. That's a great question. Now, there are two prongs to this question, or there are two prongs to the answer, so to speak. It's one. The first prong is it gets at the identification part. So if you're saying you want to call yourself something, that's just an idea of how you want to identify, and that's personal. But from a standpoint of institutions and society, and we're looking at science, we're only really talking about a physical feature. So I break it down into actually the phenotypic features of continents. So we can say people who have a predominant North American phenotype. And when you look historically, that's going to be folks really of indigenous American heritage. And you can say predominant South American phenotypes, or predominant European phenotypes, or predominant Australian. And obviously, we're talking about Aboriginal Australians and African. So the phenotypic features that we see from these groups of people are going to be not as predominant when you move around the world, because people, mate with all different types of people. So it's important, though, that we don't try to just ubiquitously throw people in a bucket. So, for instance, if someone who has a predominant European phenotype has a child with someone who has a predominant African phenotype, what do we call the offspring of those two people? Uh, and I think that's another reason why we have so much cognitive dissonance, and we have so much pain from a lot of people like that, because they feel that they don't fit in to certain arenas. They're like, well, I'm not really black and I'm not really white, and that's a really painful thing to have to deal with. But if we just drop these labels and these really arbitrary distinctions altogether, we can actually have people that really unify and see the common struggle amongst all people. Because, for instance, the folks in Haiti and the folks in the Caribbean have a very similar historical experience to the people that have come from Africa and have always resided in the United States as a result of the transatlantic trade, because they all came from that same historical context of bondage. And so the fact that we see differences and we say, "Oh, that person, they're different," we actually lose the commonality and the common struggle of all humans and humanity when we start to do those things. So the first part, from an identity standpoint, that's really a personal decision. I don't want to force people to identify in certain ways, but I would want them to think about the potential dangers and destructive nature of trying to only define themselves by those things.
Okay. And we do have about 3 more questions in about 10 minutes. So let's see how many we can get through. Our next question is, How would you propose that for-profit companies make changes as a result of recognizing the way that capitalism upholds systemic injustice?
That's a great question. It goes back into a lot of the different pieces that I talked about in terms of hiring practices. So, um, those are decisions to be made at the kind of hiring level, because for profit institutions, I'm going to say any institution, a lot of times people are hired because they know someone who knows someone who knows someone,
Yeah,
or they worked with them previously. But it's about also having an open mind and saying, I'm not just going to look at hiring people who I already know, or who have a similar background to me, or someone that I know of and they were pushed to me. But it's about opening up and thinking about some of those larger constructs. But the other piece that is so important is to have very clearly defined pay structures for certain positions, for certain experience, and for certain positions. Because when we look at pay equity, whether it's between people who identify in certain racial categories or between men and women, it's really outrageous. It's all over the place, and there should be very specific things. If you're in this role, you get paid this much. If you're in this role, you get paid this much. And then the other pieces can be based on experience or whatever the case may be. But really, we should move even past experience, and we should be looking at what is this person contributing to this organization. And so when we move away from these very loosey goosey ways in which people are compensated, we get to the equity piece, because at the end of the day, that's what we're looking for, and that's what we need to be upholding and celebrating.
absolutely. And I love that you used a very technical term there, loosey-goosey.
Yeah, loosey goosey.
So the next question is, are there suggestions you have for managing the conversation about current events, from one about racial tension to one about social justice and equality for all members of humanity?
Yeah, it's literally kind of goes back to the example I brought up about Martin Luther King. It's talking about an injustice anywhere is an injustice everywhere, and when we talk about things equally, we actually give more credence to the fact that, wow, this is just a tragedy in terms of humanity. I can recall, uh, for instance, when certain tragedies have happened, people have been radio silent about them. But certain other things, like, oh goodness, what was this? It was a few years ago. I think the Notre Dame Cathedral or something, caught on fire, and everyone was just chatter about it. Oh, this is so sad. And it's amazing how we can see differences in the way people may have commentary about a building that was destroyed, almost like a symbol. We're giving more credence to symbols than we are to people. And when we switch that and we move to upholding people over symbols, then we really start to make change. And it goes to how in today's society we have very symbolic pieces about Black Lives Matter, or about Queer Lives Matter, or whatever different constructs people are trying to go to. But at the end of the day, we're just like, wow, this is a human tragedy, and we need to talk about this and say we have no tolerance for discrimination, and at the root of it, seeing someone as different, just because they may have a certain orientation or they look a certain way. We're gonna just completely go against the fact that that doesn't matter. These are very frivolous differences that we have amongst people.
Absolutely. Um, our next question is, eliminating the construct of race seems like a great goal. While that's happening, though, how do you feel about extending additional help to groups that have been historically disadvantaged?
Yeah. So one of the things that I think, looking at things within how society is now, goes back to one of the pieces I brought up in terms of hiring and empowering the people within certain communities. We know segregation is very, very prominent across the whole country. You can cross one street and the composition of those communities are vastly different than the compositions of the community right on the other side of the tracks. And what happens a lot of times is we lose that sense of equity because we don't hire and empower the people within communities. I mean, it's really a tragedy when you go to a community and the people that live there don't have the jobs there. They don't own the businesses there. The companies that service the infrastructure of those places are not run by the people that work there. I know in Detroit, for instance, one of the biggest talks right now is about how all the construction is going on, whether in downtown Detroit or in other places. But the actual construction companies that are servicing these places come way out from the suburbs, and they're not the actual companies from the people that live and work in those areas. And that's just crazy. I mean, one of the things that we know from an economic standpoint is communities are upheld and sustained when the dollar stays in that community longer. So one of the biggest detriments is for communities that are predominantly comprised of people who identify as Black. The velocity of money is very quick. The money leaves that community very quickly. It goes to other businesses and other institutions outside of the communities in which they live and play. And so the more that we can keep the resources amongst the people within communities, the better off we're going to be. But moving forward, though, we have to find ways where communities are working together and supporting one another, even if those communities don't necessarily look the same when you cross the tracks, so to speak.
Absolutely, absolutely. And, we do have one last comment, less a question. The comment is that parents raising kids have a large impact to begin instituting change. If parents let kids play in the sandbox or stay in the swimming pool without imposing their personal feelings, that in itself will teach kids a lot about others that may not look like them.
Definitely.
And I think that's a really great comment. That's why I wanted to highlight it and point it out. Thank you so much, Dr. Alton James, for taking this time and enlightening us and helping us learn and grow. This was actually a very powerful conversation for me personally, because it really helps me realize the salience of, I'm somebody, coming from my immigrant background. When I think about these racial constructs, I actually think about my culture. I have that cultural construct to, and that cultural heritage to fall back on. Whereas many communities, we don't have, they don't have that historical knowledge of it. But it's also what came up in my mind as we were going through your presentation and talk was really about how we need to move from, culture is very individualized.
Right. Absolutely.
It has nothing to do with our race, that racial construct. So by moving our identity formation from that racial construct to defining our culture as we practice it, and moving our identity formation more into a cultural model, I think will allow all of us to become more competent and to realize not, the disparities and inequities, but also the opportunities for equity, belongingness, and intentional inclusion by leaning into that cultural identity as opposed to any sort of superficial identities that, as you mentioned. So that was kind of the overall overwhelming thought that was swimming in my head. So thank you for that. This was so informative.
Definitely.
And I know our viewers definitely enjoyed this presentation.
And if I could, one thing that I tried to help someone understand that asked me this question before about, well, just calling people different things isn't going to make that much of a difference, or saying that it's a construct is not real. But this is what hit it home for them. I said, Santa Claus is not a real thing, right? We're adults, we know that. But the idea of Santa Claus has very real consequences in society. People spend millions and millions and millions of dollars every holiday season, kind of in the name of Santa Claus for little kids. So things can be a fabrication or a construct, but they have very real consequences. And the only way that we can actually start to make those changes is if we deconstruct the idea that those constructs exist in the first place.
Absolutely. I think that is a fantastic final thought to end this presentation on. Thank you so much to all of our listeners. And once again, thank you to our sponsors and our partners who helped us put the summit together, Essential IT, Defy the Status Quo Marketing, Zanzibar Enterprises, Nielsen, the Nielsen Company, and of course you. Thank you for that great video that you did for us at the beginning, of this entire journey. And thank you again for this amazing presentation.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, we will talk to you in the next summit, hopefully.
Sounds great. Thank you very much.
Bye.